Hey YouTube, Rollo McFlugel of McFlugel.com here. So that guy T recently put out a video where he advocates closed borders, correcting himself from his previous position in favor of open borders. So I'm going to go through his entire video and kind of offer my critique of it. So if it seems like the flow's a little bit weird, that's because I didn't pre-watch the video. As I was watching it and making this video, I would pause it, add my commentary, and then keep going. So if he says something, a few seconds later that covers something that I question him on, that's why that happened. So let's get right into it.
Hey YouTube, what's going on? Those of you who are new to this channel may not be familiar with this, but for my long-term subscribers, you might recall a video I made about a year ago entitled The Great Wall of Lauren Southern. In this video, I completely fucking wrecked Lauren on her statist immigration stance. Okay, not quite. I voiced contention with her defense of state-sanctioned borders and restrictions, of which I still hold some. But since that video has been made, I've concluded that overall, I was wrong. You guys know that I'm not one to shy away from admitting that. If the logic is consistent and the argument is convincing, I'm willing to change my position. So here, I'd like to explain my revised position on modern immigration and why I, as a narco-capitalist, no longer support the concept of open borders. So, my justification for abandoning support of open borders involves a few elements, the first being the concept of borders themselves. Now, I used to be pretty dogmatic in my opposition to the state and its functions. Philosophically, I am still a narco-capitalist.
Hold on a second. What would you say to someone who says, I'm philosophically against murder,
and do believe that the state is an illegitimate entity? But just because an illegitimate entity holds a monopoly on a legitimate concept doesn't make that concept illegitimate.
Okay, but let's just make sure to be careful not to conflate the idea of government borders and private property lines, because when someone refers to borders, they nearly never are referring to private property lines.
And it also doesn't mean that concept should be opposed completely. Borders, whether they be state-sanctioned or voluntary, are necessary to the existence of property rights. I don't think anyone can deny that, unless you're a Marxist who thinks property rights aren't legitimate beyond one's personal toothbrush. As a libertarian, I found myself arguing for the elimination of sovereign borders conceptually, saying things like, it's just an imaginary line, dude, right to travel, we're all just humans, blah, 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 blah. But the actual argument I should have been making was for the expanded recognition of sovereign borders, from collective to individual property rights.
Just to be clear, no one who argues for open borders is arguing that the borders should not be privatized.
Ideally, the goal should be giving individuals more control over their own private property. Open borders do no such thing.
If the government ceases to tell me who and what I can or cannot have on my property, how am I not getting more control of my private property?
In fact, open borders are just as much an infringement on property rights as closed borders.
Only when you strawman the libertarian open borders position.
There's no moral difference between the state saying certain people cannot be granted entry and saying that certain people cannot be denied entry.
Entry to where? Someone's private property? No libertarian open borders advocate ever has said that open borders means the government can force you to put people on your property. That's absurd.
Any more than there is a moral difference in the state telling a business owner you can't service blacks versus you can't deny blacks.
Again, how does the government not controlling who and what crosses the borders means that you have to allow someone on or use your private property?
There's definitely an emotional difference for most people, but the morality of forced association and forced disassociation are the same. But I have had libertarians disagree with this point, and they argue that open borders aren't a violation of the non-aggression principle. Oftentimes, their reasoning for this argument is that open borders are government granting allowance of public property. Allowance in terms of movement, which is a meme, allowance of the ability to acquire property, allowance to trade, etc. Whereas closed borders restrict these allowances. Allow me to pose an analogy. Let's say the state were to claim sovereignty over a woman. Let's call her Peyton. If the state involuntarily establishes sovereignty over Peyton and prohibits her from having sex with desired partners, is that an aggression? Of course. Now, let's say rather than restrict sex from desired partners, the state were to grant allowance for undesired partners to have sex with her. Is that an aggression? Yes. That's what I mean by no moral libertarian distinction. Both the involuntary restrictions of Peyton's body and the involuntary allowance of Peyton's body are both aggressions.
Yes, of course, both those positions would constitute aggression. But the libertarian position would be that while the state does claim authority over Peyton's body, it should not be enforced. And that's how you tie in the open borders position on this.
If you'd like a more realistic example, consider public schools. I don't think anyone would say public schools were any less of a coercive concept during segregation or after integration. The existence of the state claiming a right to control schools is where the aggression lies, not in whether those schools allow everyone in or restrict certain people's entry, same as modern borders. So since there is no philosophical disparity in essence, there's no argument for why either would be any more or less libertarian than the other in principle.
The real shame here is that in his last video where T argued against Lawrence Southern, he did a pretty good job of explaining the difference between being in favor of open borders and not the government restricting people from coming in and importation of people. But it seems like he's making the same mistake that Lawrence Southern did, and he's conflating the idea of open borders and importation of migrants.
With this established, you're now forced to weigh the utilitarian disparities between open borders and closed borders.
This is code for I'm about to engage in some central planning.
And personally, from my perspective, the cost-benefit favors closed borders by a landslide.
Great. Let's hear how that guy T solved the economic calculation problem.
The first reason is the welfare state. In my last video to Lauren, I argued that the welfare state isn't an argument to stop immigration, rather an argument to stop the welfare state.
Correct.
Again, wrong.
Come on, T.
Granted, I'm not opposed to immigration. I want people to have the opportunity to come to this country and prosper. It's what made America the country it is today.
But you're going to tell me who can come over, how many of them can come over, and when they can come over. Just like the government says, hey, we don't want you to not have a business, but we're going to tell you what you can sell, how many of it you can sell, what price you can sell it at.
The immigration we have today is far from the immigration we had in the 1800s. And much of that does have to do with the welfare state. No, this isn't a straw man to cover up lack of compassion for migrants or refugees, or racism, or xenophobia, or whatever the fuck buzzword you want to throw out.
Not exactly sure what point T is trying to make here, but if he's trying to suggest that in the 1800s or at any other point in the United States immigration history that they basically let anyone who wanted to come in, that's just simply not true at all. There were massive immigration restrictions on both where people could come from and how many of them come, basically throughout all of the United States history.
I know those apply to some supporters of closed borders, but not me. My perspective is that it's a means of crony capitalism. Modern immigration is no longer a free market pursuit of the American dream fueled by motivation, merit, and capability. It's become a cronyistic market of forced subsidization and resource distribution, all without the consent or demand of the general population. There's multiple instances where immigrants and refugees are caught on camera saying that if welfare benefits were to dissipate, they would go back to their home country. In the state of Minnesota, which has the largest population of Somali refugees in America, estimated at 40,000+, of those, 5,000 receive cash assistance, 17,000 receive food assistance, and that's just counting the individuals, not overall households. In the state of Maine, which has the second largest population of Somali refugees, a government study showed that fewer than half of the working age population had worked in 5 years. And these facts are echoed throughout European countries as well, which we'll get to in a minute. They're facing a unique situation that's far worse than America. But
that all sounds like a great reason why we should end the welfare state. But if you want to use the government to solve a problem created by the government, go ahead and hold your breath and see how that works out for you.
But wrapping up on the welfare point, it's just not appealing. What value does the host population receive in exchange for subsidizing the importation of unemployable, culturally incompatible, and sometimes criminal immigrants?
Are you really going to paint immigrants with that broad of a brush? And anyway, you can't only look at the bad aspects of it, you have to look at everything. It's like how it's unfair how people who are against the use of fossil fuels only look at the pollution aspects and not how it's benefited society immensely over the course of its history.
The answer is nothing, outside of personal feelings of gratification.
There's also the great economic benefits that can be gained, like the agricultural industry that benefits greatly due to the cheap Mexican labor that crosses the border, so they can provide cheap produce for the rest of us Americans.
Which is sick, by the way. Fueling your own altruistic passions at the expense of the cultural and financial well-being of others.
Nah, I think it's just morally abhorrent to stick a gun to someone's head because they're on the wrong side of an imaginary line created by the state.
I think the best way to describe modern immigration economically is a tax. Modern immigration has become a tax on the host population.
Based on what? I mean, that's a huge claim that you're making, and I really want to know how you're backing that up.
I want you to think about that. Just how fucking evil that is. Granted, if you don't care about immigrants and you want them all out of the country anyway, sure, it makes sense. If you want to disincentivize something, turn it into a tax. But for those who actually want people who are seeking a better life to have the opportunity to come to America and pursue a prosperous and secure life for themselves and their loved ones, and above all, be welcomed by the native population, willingly, not from coercive mandates or sympathetic guilt, but from a love for their ethics, contributions, and shared aspirations of the American dream. To see an immigrant's desired pursuit of the American dream become a tax on someone else's pursuit of the American dream, it's an extraordinary bastardization of what it once meant to immigrate to this country.
Stop romanticizing immigration, especially what immigration used to be like, because anyone who came to this country and from a new culture or society was normally people didn't like them. There was a lot of discrimination against them and bigotry and hatred. So I don't know where you're getting this whole idea that people come here and share our values and it was always, great and fantastic until recently when, people who are Muslim or Mexican or some group that we don't particularly like is coming in.
Again, I was wrong to make that claim to Lauren about the welfare state. While the welfare state is definitely an argument to stop the welfare state, it's also an argument to stop immigration as well.
Stop immigration by the force of the government? I mean, that's a statist solution to a statist problem, and that is completely antithetical to libertarianism. So let's be clear about this. That guy T supports the use of the violence and coercion of the state to centrally plan a solution to a problem. He prefers that over the voluntary transactions and associations of the market because, well, we don't have a good situation where the market can really solve our problems. Well, isn't that the same argument that people use for any state solution? Look at the healthcare industry now. People say, well, we don't have a perfect situation, so we got to have the government step in and fix these problems.
Not only in regards to the destructive economic impact that the host country suffers as a result, but also because it philosophically changes the nature of what immigration is, transforming it from a voluntary investment of one's human capital to contribute value to the native market to a parasitic invasion to consume resources with no obligation of creating value to remain.
So does that guy T also believe that women on welfare shouldn't be able to get pregnant and have kids?
Also has a similar effect on capitalism through corporate welfare, but we'll save that for another video. But the statement of you can't have open immigration and a welfare state reigns true in more ways than simply economic. It corrupts so many integral motivations of human action.
So let's use the greatest corrupter of human action that there is, the state, to solve the problem.
I guess leftists are going to have to decide which one they value more, but chances are they don't even care to see the damage caused by having both. Speaking of the left, my next utilitarian libertarian argument for favoring immigration restrictions is the left's barriers to prosperity and assimilation. This is one that I don't see many people calling out. The left likes to parade themselves as the ones who care the most about immigrants. But when it comes to fostering an environment for immigrants to do well economically and socially, they suck at it. I don't know whether they're deceptive or oblivious. Either way, they're counterproductive.
Okay, I don't disagree with your criticism of leftists here, but by saying that we're not going to let you immigrate because of that reason is a leftist argument. Because you know what? We're doing this for your own good. We're going to stick a gun to your head for your own good. It's purely a leftist argument.
Think about this line of reasoning for a second. I think we should have more low-skilled immigration from what amounts to developing third world countries. I also think that we should raise the cost of employing these low-skilled immigrants to $15 an hour. How stupid is that?
Pretty much as stupid as someone who calls themselves an anarchist advocating for government solutions.
bringing in tons of unskilled people from developing countries, sticking them on welfare, raising the federal minimum wage to price their labor out of the market, and expecting anything other than mass unemployment. But it doesn't stop there. In addition to raising the minimum wage, leftists also want to raise corporate tax rates, which disincentivizes companies from creating jobs in America. So you want to bring immigrants over, raise the cost of hiring them, decrease the incentive for job creation, and to top it all off, push regressive propaganda in the media and schools about our leaders hating immigrants, the majority of our population being racist and xenophobic. So now you have a bunch of low-skilled immigrants competing in a scarce, high-skill, and artificially high-value job market against the host population they have been led to believe is overwhelmingly racist. Tell me, what about that sounds appealing? What about that gives me any reason to support this initiative? Leftists might not know it, but they're the biggest threat to immigrants having a chance in this country.
I don't disagree with any of that. But by restricting immigration by means of the state, you are punishing the victim.
They are elitist children who believe that you can solve all the world's problems by redistributing wealth. People in Mexico are struggling economically because of lack of employment opportunities. Let's move them to America. When they get here, what do you mean they're not getting paid at the same hourly rate as a college-educated nurse? Raise the minimum wage when it's too expensive to employ them. What do you mean income inequality has skyrocketed after flooding America's lower class with unemployed third-world migrants? Raise corporate income taxes. When the president tries to bring back jobs, they ask, what do you mean Trump's putting tariffs to disincentivize companies from employing Mexicans? He's such a racist. My God, these people are cancerous. They don't care about immigrants. They don't care about helping to grow the economies of these people. Stefan Molyneux put it brilliantly in his video on the Muslim ban. You would help far more people, far more, by offering to resettle them in the Middle East compared to the fraction of people you would help by importing them to the West. Same with Mexico and Central America. You would help so many more people by employing them in their own country than you would bringing them to America, where the cost of living is higher, qualifications for skills in job market is higher, and everything else. And that's not an argument against letting in immigrants, but an argument against improperly incentivizing their migration from their home country to the West through what amounts to bribery via welfare. Again, it's not about you feeling good about yourself. It's about helping people who need it in a way that yields maximum benefits. And leftists seem to have no concern for maximizing benefits, only maximizing their self-righteous agendas. Economics, social cohesion, and security be damned.
That's all well and good, but how does that justify using the state to close the borders? Just because leftists can be idiots?
Which brings me to my final point, the security threat of Islamic refugees in the West. In my response video to Lauren, I noticed that I didn't refute her argument for immigration restrictions based on culture. In fact, I pretty much ignored it. So I apologize for that, Lauren. You were nice enough not to call me out on it at the time, but I did notice, so my bad. Rather than address her concern, I chose to instead focus on whether state restrictions on borders violated the NAP.
Well, the culture argument isn't not a legitimate argument. If you want to keep your culture, keep your culture. By immigrants moving in around you, that they're not forcing you to abandon your culture. That's absurd. If you want to keep your culture, continue to practice it. Furthermore, the argument appealing to the NAP is the correct argument to have.
Presumably because I was being autistic and thought cultural incompatibilities were irrelevant to the discussion of the state's legitimate or illegitimate role in controlling borders.
So your argument against me is that I'm autistic. Great.
When in reality, as I mentioned at the start of this video, since there's no philosophical distinction between aggression via forced association through open borders and forced disassociation through closed borders,
the aggression that comes with welfare given to immigrants is committed by the state, not the immigrants themselves. But if you're to argue that it's justified to use violence to kick those immigrants out because they may or may not receive welfare, then shouldn't you also be justified to kick the people out of the country that are currently on welfare, even if they're already citizens of the country? Let's not legitimize any ideas of citizenism. As human beings, we're all equal in the sense that we have the same rights and obligations to other people.
My blinding obsession with the nap was the irrelevant argument at the time, not her valid concern for the threat refugees pose in terms of both cultural preservation and security.
So wait, you think the non-aggression principle doesn't apply when someone comes in that may make it a little bit inconvenient for you to practice your culture?
Wait a minute, T. Are you saying that Muslim refugees are inherently a threat? Individually? No.
But let me guess, that's not going to stop you from penalizing all those individuals because the actions of a few.
No, not all. Hashtag not all. But statistically, yeah. By every conceivable measure, as a general aggregate, they are a threat. Let's start with the socio-political threat in terms of democratic influence of government by both voting and grassroots legislative appeals to politicians.
As if voting is ever going to be the solution to any problem.
Like I mentioned earlier about a welfare state being incompatible with mass immigration, democracy, I believe, is also incompatible with mass immigration.
Do you know what's also incompatible with democracy? Libertarianism and ethics.
I know everyone says that it's the worst system except for all the others tried, that's quite debatable in its own respect, but it's definitely not sensible for democratic governments. The values and legal systems that define a libertarian social order must be preserved if you're to have any hope of sustaining a libertarian society.
And you get to that libertarian society through unlibertarian means?
It would be quite different if, say, we lived in a system where different cultures could integrate into your society without having the means to strip you of your rights. But unfortunately, that's not the case. Our rights are subject to an ever-growing intrusive state, and we're already having a hard time defending them against the left.
And so you want the state to retain some power, even though that's the biggest problem. It doesn't make logical sense what you're saying.
Introducing another demographic who is opposed to individualism and Western liberal values doesn't sound like it would fare well for a hopeful libertarian social order.
Because we're so close right now. We're so close to that libertarian society that if Muslims come in, they're just going to mess everything up on us. And all that work is going to go down the drain. It's not like the vast majority of current American citizens have deeply held status beliefs. No, that's not the case.
And that's true even if they aren't voting. We've already seen that politicians bow politically when it comes to virtue signaling for migrants and refugees. There's no reason to assume that that would stop if we brought in even more.
Like you said in your last video, don't say that opening the borders and bringing in more immigrants is the same thing. There's a difference.
That's sociopolitics. Muslim refugees are also a threat ideologically. Islamic theology teaches the importance of lying and deceit as tactics of destroying infidels and conquering lands.
So all Muslims believe and adhere to the cherry-picked and bastardized version of the Quran that you're talking about right here. And if you were to ever meet a friendly Muslim, that you could just make the unfalsifiable claim as, well, he's just actually being nice to your face and he wants to kill you as soon as he gets the opportunity.
Link in the description. Do I believe all Muslims obey this command from the Quran? No. But when you know a theology calls for the destruction of non-Islamic structures and cultures, it's probably not wise to import mass amounts of fundamentalist Islamic theists who largely have no education outside of their religion, no experience in interacting with Western cultures or any culture that's non-Islamic, and no respect or tolerance for non-Islamic values.
Actually, what the Quran teaches is that you should be tolerant of people with views that are not Muslim and should live peacefully among them.
In the 15th century, Spaniards used Catholic theology to justify their conquest of the Americas. If the Native American Indians had the means and knowledge of modern America, would anyone argue that it'd be unreasonable for them to prevent mass migration from Europe to America?
And that theology they used was a bastardization of Catholicism. Catholicism hasn't changed since then and now. Furthermore, Muslims right now aren't coming over and conquering anyone. They're coming over and just settling into neighborhoods.
Putting aside whether you enjoy America as it is today or whatever, would it be unreasonable for a native population to oppose the free movement of people from a foreign country who have a fundamentalist adherence to their religious scripture that calls for the destruction of the native people and their culture unless they convert to worshiping Christ and the political framework outlined in the Bible?
Yeah, I guess, but that's not what's happening with the Muslims right now.
I would say no. And it's also not unreasonable for America and Europe today to advocate the preservation of their culture from incompatible influencers.
Sure, preserve your culture. I don't think anyone has a problem with you trying to do that, but don't use aggressive violence against peaceful people to do it.
Especially a culture that has never had a sectarian enlightenment and opposes liberalism and freedom to such a degree.
That's just ignorant and wrong. Have you never heard of the Ottoman Empire? And speaking of which, after the fall of Constantinople, according to Byzantine history, the Sultan's actions were described as such. On the third day after the fall of our city, the Sultan celebrated his victory with a great joyful triumph. He issued a proclamation. The citizens of all ages who managed to escape detection were to leave their hiding places throughout the city and come out into the open, as they were to remain free and no question would be asked. He further declared the restoration of houses and property to those who had abandoned our city before the siege. If they returned home, they would be treated according to their rank and religion, as if nothing had changed.
I mean, most leftists get up in arms when a fucking Walmart moves to their town, fearing undesired economic and cultural implications. How do you think a massive influx of unemployed Islamic migrants from war-torn countries is going to affect your economy and culture?
Would simply opening the borders and not actually importing anyone into the country really bring all of those refugees over to the United States? I'm sure we'd get some, but there's a lot of countries they'd have to go through and a lot of other places they could settle in before having to make a huge trip literally around the world to the United States.
Yeah, think about that. Lastly, and probably the most devastating concern, Islamic migrants pose a present and objective threat to the security of Western people. This is especially true for Eastern Europe, the most obvious threat being that of terrorism. 1 in 7 Syrian refugees openly admit to having sympathies for ISIS. Granted, that's not the majority, nor is it as bad as it sounds, since less than 20% of refugees and migrants actually come from Syria, but it's a relevant factor to consider nonetheless.
So how about the United States stops bombing those countries over there and not creating environments where people would become sympathetic to groups like ISIS who were fighting off the foreign invaders? Not justifying ISIS, they're obviously a terrible group, but let's apply some common sense to this. And look at it from a little bit different perspective. All right, so you're afraid that 1 out of every 7 refugees is sympathetic to ISIS. But what about the vast majority of Americans who are not only sympathetic, but supportive of the American military, which goes over to these refugees' countries and murders and destroys their countries? That's why they're refugees in the first place for the most part. So do you think that they look kindly to Americans who support that stuff? And do you think they're comfortable that Americans think that way?
ISIS has also confirmed that they are smuggling in fighters via illegal immigration and state-sponsored refugee resettlement programs. And yes, much of the current destabilization in the Middle East is due to Western intervention. This is the creation of favoring aggression-based international militarism over defense, the George W's and Hillary Clintons of the world. But as cold as it may sound, what's done is done. Now the question is whether it's a good idea to let people in from these countries that are destroyed by American-backed war coalitions and drone strikes, plagued with anti-American militia groups, and impoverished by American-backed economic sanctions.
Nah, it'd just be better to say you're better off rotting and dying.
Do you think they'll be happy to see us? Over 70% of European Muslims would like to see Sharia as the dominant law of the land. You might think, well, that's just free speech, so what? But turning entire European neighborhoods into no-go zones backed by vigilante enforcement militias is not just free speech.
So let me ask this. When there actually are problems with Muslim immigrants coming over and causing violence and havoc in certain neighborhoods, do you think that part of the problem is that these European governments don't let people adequately defend themselves?
Finding stockpiles of weapons being smuggled in by mosques on a near weekly basis is not just free speech. Refugee employment rates in Europe are abysmal compared to America. This is in part due to refugees' lack of skills, but also because European market regulations make it much more difficult to employ even native Europeans.
Again, not the immigrants' fault.
Let alone hundreds of thousands of migrants who can't speak English. Crime rates in Germany, Sweden, France, and other countries have skyrocketed due to the migrant crisis, including sexual assault. Sweden, in particular, has become the rape capital of Europe, which is ironic because historically Sweden is known for its defense of sexual autonomy, being one of the first countries in the world to criminalize marital rape in 1965. which is not a crime under Sharia or in most Islamic majority countries. To see a country so socially dedicated and advantageous in pursuing justice for victims of sexual assault be transformed into the rape capital of its native continent in less than a decade, it's astonishing. And yes, some of those rapes are committed by native Swedes and other Europeans, but 77% of rapes in Sweden are committed by Muslim men.
Let's concede this. You think the government's going to solve the problem for you? Take a look at Sweden's gun laws. They're not very friendly. Do you think that there would be as many rapes if people were actually allowed to carry guns?
And to put that into even further context, Muslim men make up only 2% of the population of Sweden. 2%. Responsible for 77% of rapes. Using basic math, imagine the effect on crime if that number was 10% Muslim men or 15%. Just make a prediction and tell me, does it make sense to continue?
This sounded pretty nuts to me. So I went on Wikipedia and typed in rape in Sweden, and I came across this. There have been several international comparisons made, placing Sweden at the top end of the number of reported rapes. However, police procedures and legal definitions vary widely across countries, which makes it difficult to compare rape statistics. For example, Sweden reformed its sex crime legislation and made the legal definition of rape much wider in 2005, which largely explains a significant increase in the number of rapes reported in the 10-year period of 2004 to 2013. The Swedish police also record each instance of sexual violence in every case separately, leading to an inflated number of cases compared to other countries. Additionally, the Swedish police have improved the handling of rape cases in an effort to increase the number of crimes reported. Raised awareness and a shifting attitude of sexual crimes in Sweden, which has been ranked as the #1 country in gender equality, may also explain the relatively high number of reported rape. That doesn't prove you wrong, but it should at least lead you to realize that you got to do a little bit more research into this.
But T, you're not looking at the individual, man. You're being a collectivist. Fuck you. All right? People who only see individualism when it's convenient.
That's exactly what you're doing right now.
Imagine if a fraternity on a college campus was responsible for 77% of rapes on that campus. I don't even have to paint a picture. You know what the response would be.
Funny that you should bring up college and rape as the example here, because you know all those studies and statistics that they have saying that there's this huge rape epidemic that's out of control on colleges? Yeah, they've all been proven to be bunk.
But T, it's not all of the fraternity, man. You can't make judgments based on the collective actions of others. Yes, the hell we can.
Who's this we? The government? Because I don't want you to steal my money to enforce your own personal views on this.
This recent popular aversion to seeing collectives has gotten out of hand, where people are now dogmatically screeching individualism even in the presence of factual, observable data.
Well, I've shown we should question the data you presented.
Individualism is not meant to be a hindrance to our ability to reason. It's meant to be an aid, to help us make smarter decisions while acknowledging the sovereignty of the individual. In argumentation, individualism should not serve as a deterrent to logic. Yes, we should cherish the individual, but we shouldn't let that blind us from the reality of averages, nor should we let averages blind us to the reality of individuals.
Okay, let's talk about averages. Because on average, and by on average, I mean every single time it touches something, the government messes it up and makes it worse. And you agree with that, except in this one case of borders. This one time, it's actually going to work out the way that I, as in that guy T, thinks it will. Let's see how that goes.
It's a fine line, I know, but to say that we can't allow averages to influence policy at all is nowhere close to the line of rationality.
And it's such a fine line, and individualism is so important that the last institution that we want to leave this up to managing correctly is the state.
I believe that borders should be privatized. I believe that individuals should have maximum legal sovereignty over their own private property, and through that, they should seek to cooperate voluntarily with others to ensure maximum social sovereignty over their territories.
Agreed. So I don't know where this other stuff you're saying is coming from.
That's how I envision a libertarian social order. Not, just screw borders, let everyone move wherever they want.
This is great because you're straw manning your own position that you had in the last video where you argued against Lawrence Southern. There's no libertarians that I'm aware of who advocate for open borders that say everybody go wherever they want. It doesn't matter what the private property owner says. No, all open borders means is that the state does not enforce the borders. It means it does not regulate who and what goes across it. Private property owners would still be there to dictate what goes across and who goes across their property lines. It's pretty simple. I don't understand why it's so difficult for a lot of libertarians to get this idea. But instead, it's just this constant straw man of saying that I don't want the government to regulate who comes over here. And then they translate that into, I want the government to bring people over here and they can go wherever they want. It doesn't matter what the owners of the property say.
But respecting the rights of sovereign property owners and allow them to pursue their own preferred preservation, whether it be economic, cultural, identitarian, whatever. But as things stand today, where certain market functions are monopolized by the federal government, I do not believe there is a valid philosophical complaint to be made against libertarians who want their government to act as a market actor would.
There it is, the fatal conceit, relying on central planning.
We wouldn't say that since the state currently holds a monopoly on police, anyone who believes police should protect our property rights is unlibertarian. Why would we say the same in regards to defending our economic infrastructure and cultural framework of secularism and classical liberalism?
Because it's not the same. When you argue for closed borders, you're arguing for the state to infringe upon people's rights.
I'm not against immigration. I want to make that perfectly clear.
Understood.
I know amazing people from Mexico, Central America, Europe, and the Middle East who want to have a chance to move to the West and pursue a better life. And I want them to be able to. But the immigration that exists today is not one fueled by self-reliant ambitions or wealth creation. And since it's become so destructive to wealth and dangerous to safety, I can't bring myself to find a reason to not support calls for its limitation.
That's always what the trade-off is, though, right? Trade your rights and we'll give you safety.
Not just for the immediate protection of property and well-being, but also for the future preservation of liberal enlightenment, freedom, social cohesion, and capitalism. Hopefully, we can focus on working towards expanding those values and systems to developing nations in hopes of growing global wealth and reforming illiberal cultures. Because the only thing mass acceptance of refugees is doing right now is regressing our society's affluence and turning the idea of liberty into an even greater minority during a time when so few are already fighting so hard to maintain it. So that pretty much sums up my current position. Lauren, I appreciate you being such a good sport and helping influence my current perspective.
So I cut out the end of his video just because he's kind of wrapping everything up and it doesn't have too much to do with what he was talking about. Everything he needed to say about this was already said. So I just want to reiterate that being in favor of closed borders means that you're in favor of the government acting. And that's always aggression. It's anti-libertarian. The libertarian position for everything should be the market should take care of it. So every time you're asked the question, should the government, you should say no. So I have a lot of supporting links below. I've written a lot about open borders. If you've followed McFlugel.com at all, you'll know that we are going at it with Liberty Hangout because they have a closed borders position too. So there's several articles about that. There's a podcast episode, and then some kind of some pieces supporting some of the ideas behind open borders that we have. Also, I will link to a couple of the sources that I have for information I presented in this video. And finally, I have two books that I would challenge T to read that I have for him. The first one is Migrants to the Metropolis, The Rise of Immigrant Gateway Cities. That's edited by Marie Price and Lisa Benton Short. It's a collection of essays about different major migration places in the world, big cities like New York, Toronto, Sydney, Riyadh. And it kind of just gives a fairly objective account of who's going there, why they're going there, and what the local and national governments are doing, and kind of how it affects things. So it was a real eye-opener for me. And the second book is Guarding the Golden Door, American Immigration Policies and Immigrants Since 1882. That is by Roger Daniels. A great book about the history of the United States, how it deals with immigration. Another big eye-opener, because I think that immigration in the past has gotten romanticized, and I think a lot of people don't really understand how bad the policy has been basically since the existence of the country, or at least for this book, 1882. So I would love for that guy T to, respond and see what he says about this, because as an open borders advocate, I've tried to make it clear over and over and over again. I'm not for the importation of anyone by the state. I don't want the state to do anything. I realize that the state exists right now, and we're not going to get rid of borders anytime soon so we can privatize it as it should be done, as that guy T says he wants it to be done. So in the meantime, I just think that the state shouldn't enforce control over the borders. Just like, all right, we have taxation right now and regulation. Before we can completely undo it, I think they should just not enforce it. So basically, nullification of it. So that's really the position I have, and the property owners after that are free to determine who and what goes on their property. Fairly simple. So it's just following basic property rights and really just ignoring the state. That's what we really should be doing. We shouldn't be legitimizing it in any way. So thanks for watching or listening. Be sure to check out mcflugel.com, where we've got a pretty extensive blog, and we have a weekly podcast. And subscribe to the YouTube channel, of course, and subscribe to the blog. All these things can be found at mcflugel.com. And please like, share, send it out to everyone. All right. Thanks for watching. Bye.